Mount Erebus. Named for the Greek god of darkness and son of chaos, this ice-shrouded volcano has loomed over the freezing waters of Antarctica for as long as anyone can remember, but due to its extreme remoteness, has been seen by very few. But what if you could see this magnificent wonder from the comfort of an airline seat with a glass of champagne in your hand? That was exactly what Air New Zealand promised to its customers starting from January of 1977, to break down the walls of the last frontier and to democratize Antarctica. And that was an idea that would ultimately end in horror. Air New Zealand first proposed to operate commercial tourist flights to Antarctica already back in 1969. The idea was then to use passenger DC-8s and fly tourists from New Zealand to McMurdo Station, an American research base, and then to fly them back home again. Now that idea actually got quite far into the planning stage, but in the end it was shelved because it was just too expensive to land at McMurdo to refuel, and the airline's gas-guzzling DC-8s just weren't able to make the round trip without stopping. But the idea never fully went away. Instead, it just lingered on a shelf for a few years until in 1976, when the Australian flag carrier Qantas announced that they would soon start doing non-stop sightseeing flights over to Antarctica. By that time, Air New Zealand had acquired a fleet of new 3-engine DC-10s, which had much better range than the DC-8s and were therefore capable of flying all the way to McMurdo and back non-stop. Now this was not going to be your average commercial flight. Instead, this was something that no airline had ever tried to do before. You see, sightseeing trips involve a lot of factors that we pilots don't normally have to consider, since the goal with those isn't to get the passengers from A to B as safely and efficiently as possible. Instead, it's to entertain them. A sightseeing flight might therefore involve low-altitude flying to give the passengers a good view of the scenery and a lot of visual navigation, basically hand-flying the airplane with reference to landmarks, which is something that we typically never do in normal airline operations. That obviously also requires maintaining visual meteorological conditions, or VMC, instead of just flying through the clouds under instrument flight rules like we would normally do. Now, doing this in a Twin Otter over the Grand Canyon is one thing, but doing it in a DC-10 over Antarctica is a completely different ballgame. You see, back in the 1970s, a lot of terrain in Antarctica was not even properly charted, and the heights of mountains could therefore be inaccurate or even unknown. On top of that, there were almost no nav aids available like radio beacons or air traffic control radars, only a very few. But Air New Zealand did have a solution to that. You see, one of the big upgrades that came with the DC-10 was its inertial navigation system, or INS. This was an onboard system that used a set of 3 redundant gyroscopes to measure the airplane's motion through 3-dimensional space, allowing it to calculate the aircraft's position in real time. So by programming a series of geographical coordinates into the INS before the flight, the autopilot's nav mode could then couple with the INS to guide the aircraft through an entire route without any pilot intervention at all. That was provided that the pilots had correctly inputted the coordinates of the airplane's parking spots before startup. This navigation system was really quite accurate, at least for the time, with a maximum drift rate of just over 1 nautical mile per hour, and usually much less than that. It was also capable of calibrating itself by verifying its calculated position against the signals from radio beacons on the ground, like VURs, if there were any, that is. And if there weren't, well, then it was still very accurate. This meant that Air New Zealand could program the INS with the whole flight track in advance, ensuring that the DC-10 could be safely navigated throughout the sightseeing route, even if the pilots couldn't maintain visual contact with the terrain. So with that in mind, Air New Zealand eventually submitted its plans for approval to the New Zealand Civil Aviation Division, or CAD, which quickly approved them. And from early 1977, they then began operating these flights on the following reoccurring set routes. Starting from Auckland, the plane would first head south via South Island, then the Auckland Islands to the Balleny Islands off the Antarctic coast. That was before angling southeast across Cape Adare towards the spectacular Cape Hallett, where huge jagged mountains spill directly into fjords choked with icebergs. From there, the route then turned south again, following the coast of Victoria Land towards Ross Island, which is home to Mount Erebus, as well as America's McMurdo Station and New Zealand's Scott Base. Between Ross Island and the mainland is a stretch of water called McMurdo Sound, which is usually partially frozen even in the summer, and which will play a really important role in this story. So after flying past a historic hut that once belonged to explorer Robert Falcon Scott, the flights would then turn around over McMurdo Sound and head back north, past the famous McMurdo Dry Valleys, which are one of the harshest, driest deserts in the world. The route would then proceed back to Cape Hallett, then north via Campbell Islands to Christchurch, where a new crew would then take over and refuel the aircraft for the short hop back up to Auckland, completing the loop. And this entire fantastic flight was calculated to take approximately 11 hours. On board, the passengers would then enjoy continuous meal services with complimentary champagne, and all of that whilst famous Antarctic explorers used the PA system to provide live commentary of the dazzling sights outside of the windows. Air New Zealand also deliberately underbooked the flights by 24 seats or so in order to make it easier for passengers to move around and take photos. And the pilots were encouraged to invite passengers up to the cockpit to see the views and to learn more about the DC-10 if they were curious. Now, if you think that this sounds amazing, well, it was. The first two flights received awesome reviews, with passengers reporting that they just couldn't wait to do it all over again. So as a result, Air New Zealand applied for and received approval to operate 5 more flights in late 1977, followed by 4 more in November of 1978, and then a further 4 in November of 1979. And that brings us to the flight on November the 28th, 1979, the last one of these approved flights. And in fact, there were rumors that that might be the last Antarctic flight at all due to rising fuel costs. Now, competition among Air New Zealand pilots for these slots was really steep, and usually they were given away to very senior or management pilots, but not this one. Instead, the man chosen to command this very last sightseeing flight, Tango Echo 901, was a 45-year-old captain with 11,150 flight hours under his belt, including 2,872 on the DC-10. So he was quite experienced, but not nearly as much as some of the other pilots that he had outcompeted for the slot. Now, that might have been because he was known by his colleagues as a highly meticulous and conscientious pilot, as well as just a great guy to work with. Anyway, his second in command was going to be a 37-year-old first officer with over 7,900 total hours, including more than 1,300 on the DC-10. And due to the length of the flight, he was then also backed up by a 39-year-old relief first officer. The flight crew then also included a primary and relief flight engineer who had over 10,800 and 6,400 hours respectively. But it is worth noting here that the only one of these crew members who had actually flown to Antarctica before was the primary flight engineer. And this was something that would later become a bit of a sore point. You see, according to Air New Zealand's operating specifications, pilots flying to certain areas, including Antarctica, were required to have flown to that region at least once before under supervision, before they could fly there as pilot in command, which this captain had not done. Apparently, the CAD had waived this requirement at the request of Air New Zealand, who thought that it was unnecessary since the flights wouldn't even land in Antarctica anyway. But it later emerged that the US personnel over at McMurdo Base were not too impressed by this. You see, their pilots had to fly in Antarctica for a full season before they could be given a command position. So some of them felt that Air New Zealand was being quite reckless by sending down pilots with no Antarctic experience at all. Which I think is a fair point, given that these flights might have to do visual navigation in a potentially very hazardous environment with many challenges specific to Antarctica. Now, if you are heading for Antarctica or maybe somewhere else for the holidays, I am guessing that the last thing that you want is to worry about losing touch with your friends and family back home. Or spending your precious vacation time hunting down local SIM cards to avoid crazy roaming fees. Staying connected in today's world should be simple, affordable and hassle-free, and now, thanks to today's sponsor, Horrifying, it finally is. Horrifying's new eSIM subscription, Horrifying plans keeps you connected in over 160 countries with one simple setup. No more need to swap a SIM every time that you cross a border, and no surprise roaming charges when you get home. Just instant, reliable data wherever you go. You can choose between two monthly plans. The light plan with up to 25 GB, which is perfect for messaging, calls or sending holiday pictures, or the unlimited plan, ideal for long video calls, remote work or content creation on the go. Both plans renew monthly and automatically, so you never run out of data, and when you come home you can just pause your subscription and activate it again for the next time you travel. This is a simple one-time setup. Just create your account, choose your plan, and you'll get your eSIM details right into your inbox right away. And the best part is that you can keep your original number, no matter where you are traveling. So, to get started, scan this QR code or head over to esim.holafly.com/plans for 10% off both the monthly and annual plans when you use the code Mentour at checkout. Thank you Holafly for sponsoring this video. Anyway, on the 9th of November, 19 days before the flight in this story was due to take place, all of the pilots scheduled to fly the route attended a route briefing held by the pilot in charge of Air New Zealand's route clearance unit. And this would turn out to be a critical moment. But before we can fully dive into it, I need to quickly explain how the investigation into this accident was eventually done. Because there is a lot of controversy over exactly what happened and what was said in this briefing, and actually around almost every other aspect of this flight as well. In very basic terms, the initial safety investigation was carried out by the New Zealand Office of Air Accident Investigation, or OAAI, led by Chief Inspector of Air Accidents Ron Chippendale. But the OAAI did not have a lot of institutional experience at the time, and as that investigation just dragged on, it soon became clear that a more sweeping inquiry would also be needed. As a result of that, the Prime Minister of New Zealand appointed a judge, Justice Peter Mann, as a one-man Royal Commission of Inquiry, who would have the power to call witnesses, cross-examine, collect evidence, and ultimately come to conclusions about what really happened, why, and crucially, who was responsible. Now, these two investigations eventually ended up coming to starkly different conclusions, not only about the causes of the incident, but also about some of the basic facts of what actually happened. So as we move through this story, I'll show more and more details as we go along, but for now, you just need to know that when I refer to the Chippendale report, I mean the findings of the initial OAAI investigation, and when I refer to the Mann report, I mean the findings of the Royal Commission of Inquiry. Anyway, let's get back to that briefing. The main purpose of this route briefing was really to familiarize the flight crews with the special grid navigational procedures used below 60 degrees south latitude. Now, it did also include some information about the area they were flying to, including a video discussing the procedures and geography, as well as a 45-minute long simulator exercise. But that exercise did not include any terrain, since the simulator didn't support that, so it was really just intended to practice grid navigation. At the briefing, the pilots were also provided with a number of printouts and documents, including the navigation charts used by military aircraft at McMurdo, a rough map of the approximate route for illustrative purposes only, and a list of the coordinates that would be programmed into the INS before the flight. But one of the things that was not provided was any topographical maps depicting the exact INS track relative to the terrain, and that topic wasn't even discussed. On top of this, the video and printed materials also stated that the minimum safe altitudes in VMC was 16,000 feet until reaching McMurdo Station, after which a descent to 6,000 feet was permitted under radar guidance from McMurdo ATC. But that wasn't a regulatory minimum. In fact, New Zealand regulations only required 500 feet of terrain separation in VMC. So instead, this was an internal Air New Zealand policy that had been approved by the CAD when the agency signed off on these Antarctic flights. But several pilots who had actually flown these flights later testified to Justice Mann that at the route briefing they were told that they could descend as low as 1,500 feet, provided that they had authorization from McMurdo ATC. But the pilots who held management positions at Air New Zealand all denied that any such permission had ever been given, which forms the first of many cases of a curious disconnect between regular line pilots and the company management, which later emerged during Mann's Royal Commission of Inquiry. So you should maybe start keeping track of those just in the background. Now, there were a lot of important areas that were not covered in this route briefing, like what the basis for the minimum altitudes were, what the relevance of the military flight route shown on the McMurdo chart was, what emergency conditions would necessitate a landing on the McMurdo ice runway, and whether there were any peculiar visual or weather phenomena unique to Antarctica that could be relevant to the operation. The Mann inquiry also later found that the McMurdo controllers hadn't been informed of the minimum altitudes given to the crews, and Air New Zealand also hadn't consulted with the US Navy on the best ways to approach McMurdo. The McMurdo controllers weren't even aware that they were expected to provide radar guidance for descents to 6,000 feet south of the station, and in fact, according to the Mann report, the US controllers would have likely not approved that, since their radar coverage south of the station was practically non-existent. Now, in reality, none of the Antarctic flights actually ended up using that radar descent, for reasons that we'll get into later. But all of this just exemplifies the lack of adequate planning and coordination on the part of Air New Zealand when it came to these flights. And that was something both the Chippendale and Mann report later pointed out. In any case, after taking notes on the briefing and bringing the printouts home to study, the few selected pilots then waited for the big day. And finally, on the 28th of November, the crew members in this story arrived bright and early to Auckland Airport, feeling well and rested after having spent several days off before. Their 5-year-old DC-10 was in perfect working order, gleaming out on the apron, and the dispatch paperwork showed great weather, at least for the en route phase over towards Antarctica. The actual weather over Antarctica was reported as good to fair, with clear conditions near Cape Hallett, transitioning to 3,000 feet of broken to overcast clouds near McMurdo Station. But still, with over 40 miles of visibility under the cloud base, despite some scattered snow showers. So with this, the 5 crew members went ahead and prepared the aircraft, whilst the 15 flight attendants oversaw the boarding of their 237 passengers, including the in-flight commentator. Originally, the commentator had been supposed to be Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Mount Everest, but he had withdrawn in favor of a speaking tour in the United States. So instead, the commentator was now going to be Peter Mulgrew, a famed mountaineer and explorer who had accompanied Hillary on several major Antarctic and Himalayan expeditions. And whilst he was warming up the passengers, the flight crew set about programming the INS navigation track down towards Antarctica. Now, normally, this nav track data would be inserted directly into the navigational computer using a cassette tape, but since this was a non-scheduled flight, the coordinates of each waypoint had to be entered manually and then cross-checked. That process apparently went smoothly, and at 0817 local time, flight TE901 taxied out and then took off from Auckland, heading south over New Zealand and then out over the Great Southern Ocean. After leaving New Zealand's airspace, the pilots switched on the autopilot nav mode and started following the INS track, which initially took them over the Auckland Islands and then south to the Litany Islands, exactly as programmed. The flight data recorder was capable of recording any manual updates to the airplane's coordinates in the navigation computer, but according to the Mann report, no updates were made. And that most likely meant that the airplane was on course relative to identifiable landmarks as it passed the Litany Islands, and that the INS drift was likely close to zero. At some point later in the flight, as they approached Cape Hallett on the Antarctic mainland, the flight data recorder data showed that the captain disengaged the nav mode and adjusted the course slightly using the autopilot's heading select mode, and that was probably to give the passengers a better view of the spectacular mountains and glaciers in that area. Then, after passing the Cape, the captain re-engaged the nav mode and resumed the nav track, again without making any manual adjustments to compensate for drift. At this point, there were no signs of any problems. The weather was absolutely gorgeous, with hardly any clouds, and the passengers were enjoying the excellent food and expert commentary, just as advertised. As the flight proceeded almost due south down the coast, following the nav track, the crew soon made radio contact with Scott Base over on Ross Island. And as was customary on these flights, they then broadcasted the communication over the public address system, cracking jokes forth and back to entertain the passengers. Now, around this time, the crew would have also performed a descent briefing in anticipation of their descent to a lower altitude for the sightseeing part in the McMurdo area, but the cockpit voice recorder only captured the last 30 minutes of the flight, so we don't know exactly what was said here. But when the CVR did start, at time 13:17, the captain could be heard saying, "I think we'll start down a little early here." That comment likely meant a slight change of plans from the earlier briefing, maybe due to some reports that they had received about the cloud base now having reduced down from 3,000 to 2,000 feet in the area ahead. Now, the flight was still in clear conditions at this point, but the cloudy areas ahead of them would likely have been visible in the distance. So the first officer now called up the McMurdo Area Control Center, known as MAC Center, using long-range HF radio to request some more information. The MAC Center responded and told them that conditions in the area were still cloudy at 2,000 feet, with visibility below the clouds at 40 miles and scattered snow showers. The first officer thanked him for that and then requested a descent clearance, which was quickly followed by MAC Center clearing them to descend down to 18,000 feet. And the controller then also added that there were gaps in the cloud layers located 75 to 100 nautical miles northwest of the station. The captain now said, "Doesn't look very promising, does it?" To which the first officer and flight engineer both agreed. But at that moment, MAC Center transmitted the following message. "Roger, within a range of 40 miles of McMurdo, we have a radar that will, if you desire, we can let you down to 1,500 feet on radar vectors. Over." This was an offer to guide the flight down through the clouds and to get them below the 2,000-foot cloud base where the visibility would be good enough to show the passengers some nice views. The pilots therefore immediately accepted this offer, and the captain soon used the PA to inform the passengers that they would perform a radar-guided letdown to get below the clouds for some better sightseeing. After learning that the plane was currently 114 miles from McMurdo, MAC Center asked them to try and make contact over VHF radio instead, which is a clearer and more reliable source than HF, but also has shorter range. You see, due to its longer wavelength, HF radio is able to bounce off the ionosphere to reach beyond obstacles and even beyond the horizon, but VHF radio cannot do that. Now, theoretically, Flight 901 should have been well within VHF radio range at this point, but when the first officer tried to call the controller, he got no response. Now, both Chippendale and Mann later discovered that there was a very good reason for this. Mount Erebus was towering in the way, blocking the signals, but the pilots didn't seem to realize that. And since they were now planning to descend to 1,500 feet on the nav track, apparently flying directly towards this giant mountain, this raised a crucial question. Did the pilots actually know where the nav track was taking them? This was something that would eventually divide both the investigations and New Zealand. You see, it turns out that the final nav waypoint on their route had been altered at 2 o'clock in the morning on the day of this flight, just 6 hours before it departed, and nobody had informed the crew. Now, how that happened is a complicated and controversial story that will take us back to the initial planning stage of these Antarctic flights, so stay with me. The way an INS nav track is usually made is by stringing together the coordinates of ground-based nav aids in order to provide some redundancy. So if the INS would stop working for some reason, those nav aids could then be used instead. But in this case, that had not been done. The only nav aids in this region were a non-directional beacon, an NDB, located at McMurdo Station, as well as a nearby TACAN, which is basically a military VOR with a co-located DME, or distance measuring equipment. Now, the DC-10 wasn't equipped to receive the TACAN, but it could use the DME and the NDB if needed. The charts of the area also included a couple of other known sets of coordinates, like the location of Williams Field, the ice runway at McMurdo. And for the first 2 Antarctic flights in 1977, Air New Zealand's navigational section had chosen the coordinates of Williams Field as the turnaround point of the nav track. But when they then decided to draft a permanent computer flight plan, later that same year, they thought it would be best to change the endpoint to the NDB instead. like I said, for redundancy. Now, according to Air New Zealand's chief navigator, he assembled this new list of coordinates from scratch with reference to a worksheet that still had Williams Field as the final waypoint, so the NDB coordinates were therefore never actually entered. And he also testified that during this data entry, he mistyped the longitude of the waypoint as 164 degrees 48 minutes east instead of 166 degrees 48 minutes. And that inadvertently moved the final waypoint 25 miles to the west of Williams Field, out into the middle of McMurdo Sound. He then visually checked his work but failed to detect this error, so this incorrect waypoint was then used for the next 12 flights, without anyone noticing. Now, the reason no one noticed was likely because most Antarctic flights encountered good weather in this area, so the pilots would normally leave the nav track and fly visually for sightseeing purposes there, meaning that nobody actually followed the nav track all the way to its endpoint to find out where it was. And even if someone had noticed this supposedly erroneous track that everyone was using, this seemed perfectly reasonable. You see, if you draw a straight line from Cape Hallett to this erroneous waypoint, that line would take the aircraft down the middle of McMurdo Sound, meaning over flat water and sea ice well away from any terrain. And that would also provide the passengers with a great view of both Mount Erebus to the east and the mountains of Victoria Land to the west. So this was the story that the chief navigator told the Mann Commission of Inquiry, but just this man's personal belief was that the navigation section actually had moved the endpoint to this location on purpose. You see, if you instead draw a straight line from Cape Hallett to the McMurdo NDB, well then the flight track will pass directly over the summit of the 12,450 foot high Mount Erebus, which doesn't make a lot of sense for a number of different reasons. For one, it would have made it impossible for the passengers to actually see Mount Erebus, and it would have also routed the plane through a VHF radio and radar shadow north of the mountains, as we've already seen. On top of that, at Air New Zealand's minimum altitude of 16,000 feet in that sector, the flight path would potentially have exposed the aircraft to volcanic hazards, including columns of boiling steam and smoke, as well as lava rocks that could be thrown thousands of feet up into the air. And that wasn't just a theoretical hazard, because records show that Mount Erebus was erupting between 2 and 10 times per day throughout much of the 1970s. So, in just this man's view, Air New Zealand couldn't possibly have intended for that to be the correct flight path, especially when it made so much more sense to just fly to that supposedly incorrect waypoint. And that wasn't the only inconsistency that just this man found. According to his report, a chart had been drawn up which showed the flight routing finishing at the incorrect waypoint, and that chart was then given to the flight crews operating these flights in 1978 and also probably in 1979. Now, Chippendale's report claimed that a diagram showing a flight track straight to the McMurdo NDB had been given to the flight crew of Flight 901, but the Mann investigation found no evidence that these pilots had ever seen that map. And even if they did, that map still didn't show any terrain in the area. The track with this incorrect waypoint was then also used in the computer printout that had been given to the crew of Flight 901 at the briefing that I told you about before. But then something had happened. On one of these flights, which was flown on the 14th of November, the captain had happened to actually overfly the Takan whilst looking at the cross-track error display. That's basically showing the difference between the current coordinates and the nav track, and he was surprised to see that the error indicated was 27 nautical miles, as he thought that the flight should have been pretty much bang on. Now, he didn't think that this was a mistake, because as far as he knew, the final waypoint was always supposed to have been way out in the middle of McMurdo Sound, so this must just be a flight plan issue. But he did think that future pilots should be informed that the endpoint actually wasn't at the station as indicated. So after he landed, he phoned the line operations flight manager for the DC-10 fleet and suggested this to him. According to that captain's later testimony, he was worried that the pilots might misinterpret this distance as an INS drift error, which I think sounds very reasonable. But the line operations manager told the man inquiry that he then misunderstood this call, since he thought that the captain wanted the endpoint moved from the NDB over to the TACAN, which was obviously something completely different. You see, the US Navy had recently announced that it was withdrawing the NDB from service and would no longer maintain it, so the line operations manager had good reasons to believe that the NDB should not be used anymore as the endpoint. And likely with that in mind, he just decided to move the coordinates of the endpoint over to the TACAN. But he didn't check where the coordinates for this final point had actually been before that. And since he had no idea about that earlier typo, he thought that the coordinates had always been at the NDB, which was only about 2 miles from the TACAN, meaning that the effect on the flight plan would be negligible. What he didn't understand was that in reality, this change would move the final waypoint a full 27 nautical miles, completely changing the flight trajectory, with huge implications. So this change was then made at 2 a.m. on November the 28th and was incorporated into the list of coordinates given to the pilots later that morning, which they then manually entered into the INS. But because everybody thought that the flight track had only been moved about 2 miles, nobody bothered to actually tell the flight crew. Now, as I mentioned earlier, just this man didn't really buy this whole story. He thought that the nav track had always been supposed to go down McMurdo Sound, so he instead suspected that the navigation section had changed the endpoint to the TACAN because the CAD was about to publish a new navigation chart of the Ross Sea, which was going to include the Air New Zealand flight route on it. The original plan for the Antarctic flight that had been approved by the CAD had listed the NDB as the final waypoint, and Mann believed that instead of seeking CAD approval to use this McMurdo Sound waypoint, the airline had just used it informally, and then changed it back when it became clear that the CAD was going to find out about it. Then Mann figured that due to some miscommunication, the navigation section just forgot to inform the pilots. He felt that this was a much more believable explanation than the improbable series of errors that I described earlier, which he thought were most likely just made up to cover for whoever forgot to tell the pilots about the change. But of course we will never know for sure. Now, during the initial OAAI investigation, Chief Inspector Chippendale didn't find out about this nav track change until several months into the probe. And when the media got a hold of this information, Air New Zealand just denied the whole thing. But it did definitely happen, and Chippendale was therefore left with the question of whether the crew knew where the nav track would take them or not. In his report, he mentioned several factors that might have given the crew the impression that the nav track went down through McMurdo Sound, including some of the briefing materials. But in the report, he also wrote that there was, quote, no evidence to suggest that they had been misled by this error in the flight plan shown to them at the briefing. Now, that finding doesn't make much sense to me at all, and it didn't make much sense to a lot of other people either at the time. In fact, the captain's wife and 2 eldest daughters testified to Justice Mann that they had seen the captain making marks on an atlas and a topographic map the night before the flight, and that he had taken those maps with him onto the plane. Mann believed that because no topographic maps of the nav track was provided at the briefing, the captain had just decided to make his own by plotting the raw coordinates that he had been given on a suitable map. But remember, the printout of the waypoints provided at the briefing still contained that old, supposedly incorrect endpoint out in the middle of McMurdo Sound. So, in all likelihood, the route that the captain had so meticulously drawn onto his map wasn't the same route that was then actually programmed into the INS. And he would have been very unlikely to notice that a single digit had changed while he was manually entering these coordinates, if he was even the one who did that. On top of all of that, up until Cape Hallett, the nav track would then have been exactly the same as the one that he had plotted, and the lack of drifts during the flight would have further increased his confidence in its accuracy. He would also have been well aware from talking to other pilots that all of the previous flights since 1977 had gone down the middle of McMurdo Sound. So, with this in mind, Justice Mann found that the captain almost certainly believed that the nav track would take him down that way and absolutely not over the top of Mount Erebus. Now, some pilots, especially the management pilots at Air New Zealand, argued that as a captain he had a duty to know exactly where he was and where he was going, which is technically true, but I think it's grossly unfair in this case. You see, while it was technically possible to discover this altered nav track by cross-checking the actual geographic coordinates of the aircraft against the map that the captain had, he was very unlikely to do this when he had just performed such a check at Cape Hallett and found no appreciable drift at all. And why would his flight be any different than all of the other flights that had already flown this route? So in reality, there were very slim chances that he would discover this error, unless he would see a landmark or something that would give a clear indication of their true position. But remember, he had never been to Antarctica before. The briefing hadn't included any pictures of the terrain in this area, and Mount Erebus ahead of them was likely completely covered in clouds. Anyway, back on board Flight 901, the crew were now still attempting to make contact with the control tower at McMurdo, known as Ice Tower. Remember, Max Center had promised them a radar letdown to 1500 feet, but it was Ice Tower that had the actual radar, so they were the only ones who could approve it. However, Ice Tower didn't have HF radio capability, only VHF, and the pilots therefore now spent quite a while trying to get through to them without success. We know, of course, that this was due to the signal shadow of Mount Erebus, but the pilots probably weren't overly concerned about not getting contact. They knew that the range of the McMurdo VHF frequencies were pretty variable depending on the conditions outside, so they likely now assumed that this was causing the problem. Meanwhile, various passengers were visiting the flight deck, and continuous crosstalk between those, the off-duty crew members and the commentator, could be heard in the background on the cockpit voice recorder. This went on for about 10 minutes, until at time 13:31 when the captain said, "I'll have to do an orbit here, I think." That was then followed by an unintelligible reply, to which he added, "Well, actually, it's clear out here if we get down." He then instructed the first officer to call Max Center on HF and request further descent, because they now had ground contact and could therefore do an orbit if necessary. What the captain likely meant here was that as long as he could maintain visual contact with the ground, he could descend down below the clouds without radar guidance, and therefore without getting into contact with the ice tower. By this point, they were flying over an overcast cloud layer, which stretched from 2,000 feet up to approximately 10,000 feet, so if they wanted to fly through that, they could only do that by radar guidance. But since the captain had now spotted a gap in the clouds, and passenger photos later confirmed that this gap existed, he likely thought that since he wasn't able to receive a radar letdown, he could still get down by descending in a series of orbits through these gaps in the clouds, maintaining visual meteorological conditions the whole way down. The first officer informed Max Center of this plan, and the controller approved a VMC descent, but asked that they keep the center advised of their altitude. The captain then announced that he would make an initial orbit while descending to 10,000 feet, after which he switched the autopilot's lateral mode from nav to heading select and departed from the nav track. Now here is where we meet the second, extremely controversial aspect of this story, which was the captain's decision to descend below 16,000 feet. As you might remember, Air New Zealand had a CAD-approved company minimum of 16,000 feet north of McMurdo and then 6,000 feet to the south of the station with a radar letdown, which were both covered in that route briefing. And you might also remember that some pilots who were at those briefings informed the Royal Commission of Inquiry that they had been told that they could actually descend to whatever level that was authorized by McMurdo Control. Well, during his investigation, Chief Inspector Chippendale was unaware of these allegations, so as far as he was concerned, the captain's decision to descend below 16,000 feet at this point was an intentional violation of standard operating procedures. In fact, he would later name this decision as the probable cause of the accident, to the frustration of many. But the Mann inquiry found that it likely wasn't that simple. He discovered that virtually every Air New Zealand Antarctic flight had descended below 6,000 feet. And even worse, he believed that Air New Zealand's management had tacitly approved this practice and then withheld that information from Chippendale. Multiple previous Antarctic pilots admitted to having descended lower in the inquiry, including one who held a high rank within Air New Zealand's management, and most of them also believed that they had not violated any company policies by doing so. Now, Air New Zealand's management and executives strongly denied this, but Mann pointed out that low flying on these Antarctic flights was public knowledge, since a lot of passenger accounts mentioned flying at altitudes well below 6,000 feet. And probably the most remarkable example of this was a letter written by the president of McDonnell Douglas to Air New Zealand's CEO at the time, Maury Davis, his personal friend. After flying on one of these Antarctic flights, the McDonnell Douglas president wrote a rave review of the experience, in which he mentioned the view of Antarctica from 3,000 feet. He then personally sent this review to Davis, and it was later incorporated into an article published by a magazine owned by Air New Zealand, a copy of which was then sent to every household in the country. But incredibly, Davis still told Justice Mann that he had never read it or seen it, which Mann absolutely didn't believe. But it should be said that in Mann's view, though, 1,500 feet was a perfectly reasonable terrain separation for a sightseeing flight in visual conditions. And since regulations only required 500 feet, he believed that the CID would have approved this minimum if Air New Zealand had actually asked. But they hadn't. In fact, the former director of flight operations said that he had proposed a minimum altitude of 2,000 feet back in 1977, believing this had been approved by the CID, and he was shocked to discover that his own subordinate had later instead secured CID approval of a 16,000 feet minimum altitude, without even telling him. Now, you've probably already noticed that internal communications within Air New Zealand wasn't very good, and you'd be quite right. Mann wrote in his scathing report that the Flight Operations Department had no written procedures for handling computer flight plan changes, no written instructions on what should be included in Antarctic route briefings, no recording of important communications and decision-making processes, no central file containing all information related to the Antarctic flights, no written document related to the changes in the nav track, and barely even a memorandum between the CEO, the board of directors, or the commercial division concerning the decision to operate Antarctic flights in the first place. The Air New Zealand CEO said that he ran the airline verbally and that he wasn't a fan of issuing written instructions, which is probably why the company culture ended up like this. But his admission later took on a more sinister light when Mann discovered that the CEO had instructed airline personnel to collect any documents deemed relevant to Flight 901 and to then shred any excess copies in order to prevent leaks to the media. Some of this shredding was then accomplished by personnel who had serious conflicts of interest, and there was no clear protocol in place for what should be deemed relevant and what should be destroyed. Even worse, a number of items of evidence belonging to the pilots, including the captain's notebook, were found to have been collected and then disappeared, never to be seen again. So between the document shredding, the disappearing evidence, the withholding of information from Chippendale, the conflicting testimony from management and non-management pilots, perceived evasiveness surrounding the nav track, and implausible claims about the minimum altitudes, Justice Mann came to believe that Air New Zealand's management was systematically lying to him. He later wrote that all of this suspicious behavior was an attempt to blame the pilots for doing something that they had been led to believe was perfectly reasonable. And frankly, I tend to agree. That does sound more likely given all of this evidence. And with that in mind, let's continue into the final phase of this story. At around time 1332, the pilots discussed where to perform the descending orbit, and the flight engineer assured a passenger in the cockpit that there would soon be chances for some better photos. The captain then started the orbit to the right, at a position about 40 nautical miles north of McMurdo Station, over an area of mixed sea ice and open water that was visible through the hole in the clouds. Like I said earlier, the captain most likely believed that they were just north of the entrance into McMurdo Sound at this point, since that's where the 40-mile marker on his homemade map would have been located. But in reality, the aircraft was now more than 20 miles to the east, just to the north of Lewis Bay on the north side of Ross Island. Now, during this descending right turn, the aircraft briefly established line of sight to McMurdo, and at time 13:35, Ice Tower's test calls on VHF radio were therefore suddenly heard loud and clear in the cockpit. So the crew now informed the Ice Tower of their intention to descend to 10,000 feet in VMC conditions, and again requested a radar letdown through the clouds if possible. But before the tower could reply, the line of sight was then lost, and no further communication with the Ice Tower could be established. So instead, the crew now went back to HF radio and informed MAC Center that contact with the tower had been lost, to which they just told them to continue trying, and the first officer began calling Ice Tower over and over and over again with no response. Because of this, the captain proceeded with his visual descent through the hole in the cloud, which he planned to then follow up with a visual flight under the clouds towards McMurdo. So the first officer informed air traffic control of their intentions, and MAC Center advised them to report when they were 10 miles away from the DME station. Nobody at McMurdo knew that Flight 901 was now descending north of Ross Island instead of over McMurdo Sound, and that was because Air New Zealand had not forwarded these new flight plan coordinates to them either. Now, the aircraft should have been briefly visible on radar during that period where line of sight to Ice Tower actually existed, but even if the tower controllers would have actually seen them, they would have had no reason to believe that the pilots didn't know their true position, especially since they had said that they were in VMC and would therefore proceed visually towards McMurdo. On board the aircraft, a series of events was now happening that would further conspire to hide the true position from the flight crew. During the right orbit, passenger photographs showed that the distinctive black cliffs of Beaufort Island were clearly visible to the left of the aircraft, just a few miles to their west. Now, if the plane had been over McMurdo Sound, then this island should have been far to their east, but it doesn't appear that anyone in the flight deck recognized this. And of course, since none of the pilots had actually been to Antarctica before, and since relatively few photographs of this area were provided in the briefing, none of the crew even knew what Beaufort Island was supposed to look like. Just this man believed that confirmation bias would have likely led them to assume that this was some feature just off the coast of Victoria Land, since that's what they were expecting to see to their west. And the only person who would have known better was commentator Peter Mulgrew, but just this man suspected that he was walking from the cabin to the cockpit during the period where Beaufort Island was visible, and thus never saw it. In any case, moments later, Mulgrew did arrive in the cockpit and said that he couldn't guide if he couldn't see anything, and that there was nothing to comment on as yet. As this was happening, the Chippendale report says that the background voices could be heard inquiring as to the position of Mount Erebus, which Chippendale cited as the first of several comments indicating increasing uncertainty about the aircraft's position. But those comments were in the background crosstalk and weren't attributed to any particular person, so just this man felt that this was most likely just a conversation between some of the passengers who were still visiting the cockpit. In any case, as the crew completed the first 360 orbit, they were still in VMC, descending through 6,000 feet, but they hadn't reached the cloud base yet, so the captain decided to perform a second orbit inside of the clear area, this time to the left, whilst also continuing his descent down to 2,000 feet. The first officer therefore reported this to MAC Center, who acknowledged it, and the captain also mentioned to Mulgrew that they had received a message from Scott Base informing them that conditions were clear over the Taylor and Wright valleys in Victoria Land, but he didn't get any reply back to that. Instead, Mulgrew now addressed the passengers, telling them, "I still can't see very much at the moment. I'll keep you informed as soon as I see something that gives me a clue as to where we are." Which conclusively showed that he definitely hadn't seen Beaufort Island nor any other landmarks at this point. The aircraft continued descending, and soon the first officer called out 1,000 to go, down to their planned altitude of 2,000 feet. The captain continued using the heading select knob to steer them back around towards their original heading, and in the background, conversations between unidentified people again appeared to capture someone asking where Erebus was. Someone else responded that it was left about 20 to 25 miles, to which other people seemed to express doubt or uncertainty. But all of these lines were actually marked as unintelligible in the original transcript. Chippendale nevertheless cited his interpretation of these lines to argue that the crew was uncertain of their position and that the captain was ignoring the concerns of his flight engineers. But the Mann inquiry didn't give much for that interpretation. Not only was it doubtful that these lines were actually spoken, even if they were, there was no evidence that they were aimed at the pilots or that the pilots even heard them. Nor did the captain or the first officer seem to express any doubts of where they were at this time, whatsoever. After all, as I've said, they probably thought they knew exactly where they were and where they were going, and at this point nothing had yet happened that would break that preconception. Mulgrew now caught sight of a sliver of land in the distance, prompting him to say, "That's the edge." He didn't elaborate on what this was the edge of, but it did prove that they were definitely now in visual conditions, likely below the clouds. At time 13:47, with the aircraft now approaching its original heading, the captain re-engaged nav mode to resume the nav track. And that really should be the nail in the coffin for any argument saying that he knew where the track was taking them, or that he was uncertain about it in any way. You see, as a pilot, it's super important to not just be a slave to the navigation display. It is our job to know where the autopilot is taking us, even when flying a pre-programmed track. So if I know that the programmed track would take me towards high terrain, or if I don't know where it will take me, I just wouldn't use that track line until those things are confirmed, especially not below the minimum safety altitude. So Justice Mann and I completely agree that the only sensible explanation here is that the captain was completely convinced that the nav track was now going to take him over the open water of McMurdo Sound. There is basically no world where he would have engaged this mode if he knew that Mount Erebus was towering 10,000 feet above them, straight ahead on that same track. Now, there exists a slight misconception that Flight 901 was still flying inside of clouds from this point onwards, but both Chippendale and Mann found that this wasn't the case. This misconception probably stems from the next decision that the captain took, which was to continue descending along the nav track from 2,000 down to 1,500 feet. But passenger photographs taken during this period clearly showed that the plane was in clear air, with sea ice below and small strips of land visible in the distance. So, with the plane in clear air below the cloud base, Mount Erebus should have been clearly visible dead ahead, but the cockpit voice recorder contains no evidence that the pilots could see it. How could that be possible? Well, the answer is likely whiteout. Not whiteout as in heavy snow. In this case, the term refers to a clear air phenomenon found under conditions with the ground covered by a uniform white snow layer with an equally uniform white cloud layer overhead. When that happens, sunlight will get reflected off the snow and ice crystals, then back again off the overcast layer, back and forth in every direction until the lighting kind of blends into a completely white uniform light. Now, the way humans perceive depth and distance is largely based on sizes, contrast and shadows, but under this type of condition, all contrast disappear, which means that undulating or sloping terrain can become almost completely invisible. Now, if you're skiing, that can mean that you are skiing straight into a ditch without seeing it, but if you're flying a plane, you could completely miss rising terrain directly ahead of you. Actually, during the US mission to Antarctica between the years of 1950 and 1960, 25 accidents, representing 40% of all total accidents during that period, were attributed to this whiteout phenomenon. And it must also be said that this wasn't something rare. No, it's basically the default condition with an overcast cloud layer in Antarctica. Yet another phenomenon that the pilots hadn't been told about during that Antarctic briefing. So Flight 901 now just continued south, with its pilots blissfully unaware that they were flying straight into the jaws of an optical illusion. Meanwhile, the captain had now completed his descent down to 1,500 feet, and the first officer said, "Probably see further in anyway. which might have meant that descending would help them to see further down into what they thought was McMurdo Sound, and that it therefore could help them to identify some kind of landmarks. In the background, the CVR continued to catch snippets of conversation, which Chippendale later transcribed as "Bit thick there, eh, Bert?" and "You're really long while on instruments this time, are you?" And with that, yet another controversy erupted over the CVR transcript. During the Mann inquiry, it emerged that a group of Air New Zealand pilots and OAI investigators had listened to the CVR tapes over at the NTSB headquarters in Washington, and that they had then spent 5 days producing a transcript of the often subdued and faint conversations in the cockpit. Many lines were therefore marked unintelligible, but later in the investigation, Chief Inspector Chippendale then took the CVR to the UK and consulted with some audio analyst experts there, who helped him to flesh out this transcript. A total of 55 additions and changes were then made, none of which were reviewed by the original transcription team, nor anyone with knowledge of the crew, the DC-10 or Air New Zealand operations. Both of the lines that I just mentioned were among those added later by Chippendale, and he then used those to suggest that there was mounting alarm about the weather conditions among the flight engineers in the back of the cockpit. But Justice Mann found that neither of these lines were intelligible or even resembled what was written, which was probably maybe best exemplified by the fact that nobody in the cockpit was named Bert. Mann wrote that Chippendale himself was affected by confirmation bias, and that he therefore interpreted these unintelligible lines in a manner consistent with his preconceived notion of what was going on. Instead, the evidence actually showed that at this point there was no alarm or concern in the cockpit at all, at least not yet. To the left and right, the pilots now would have been able to see two distinct patches of land in the distance. These were the shores of Cape Tennyson and Cape Bird, which framed the entrance to Lewis Bay, immediately north of Mount Erebus. But if the pilots believed that they were actually flying into McMurdo Sound, and without having been to this area before, they probably assumed that these were the two capes at the entrance to McMurdo Sound instead. This would have happened despite the fact that the entrance to McMurdo Sound is much wider than the entrance to Lewis Bay, but in Antarctica, with no recognizable objects other than endless ice, it is incredibly hard to judge distance, even under perfect conditions. And so, confirmation bias and a lack of prior Antarctic experience likely sealed the trap. Over the next few seconds, the captain asked whether they were picking up the signal for the DME, probably because he wasn't spotting any landmarks and therefore wanted to verify their position. The first officer replied that they weren't getting anything, to which the captain commented, "Those conditions don't look very good at all, do they?" Most likely due to the increasing lack of terrain definition, but still without realizing that the white expanses ahead of them now wasn't just haze. Instead, it was the rapidly approaching slope of Mount Erebus. Anyway, in response to the captain, the commentator agreed, "No, they don't." And the captain then asked the first officer if he could try to contact Ice Tower again, probably to try and confirm their distance. The first officer tried, but again he failed. Staring out through the cockpit window, the commentator now said, "That looks like the edge of Ross Island there." To which the flight engineer responded, "I don't like this." The captain now followed up, asking the first officer whether he had gotten any response back from Ice Tower, which he hadn't, and with a feeling of sudden apprehension, the captain said, "We're 26 miles north. We'll have to climb out of this." With that, he probably meant that at a distance of 26 miles to go, they should have spotted some of the McMurdo landmarks, and since they hadn't, it was now time to climb away and reorient themselves. The first officer responded, "Yeah, you're clear to turn right. There's no high ground if you do a 180. Which wasn't actually the case. He just couldn't see the terrain due to the whiteout. The captain then switched from nav mode to heading select and started turning the knob to the right, causing the airplane to enter into a shallow right turn. Now, there was still no urgency in the pilots' voices or actions, which just shows us that at this stage they still thought that they were somewhere over McMurdo Sound and that they were now just exiting the situation due to the failure to identify landmarks, not because they believed that they were in any real danger. But that was soon about to change. Only seconds after the first officer's comment, the aircraft flew over the north shore of Ross Island, passing overhead the enormous 300-foot ice cliffs at the foot of Mount Erebus. With the mountainside now rising quickly up beneath them, the ground proximity warning system suddenly woke up and began to call out, "Whoop whoop, pull up." But this was a first-generation GPWS, not the enhanced GPWS that we have today, so it couldn't look ahead of the aircraft, only directly beneath. And with the aircraft now still flying towards the 13-degree slope of Mount Erebus at a speed of 260 knots, they were now simply out of time. Watching the radio altimeter tick down, the flight engineer called out, 500, 400, and the captain started pulling the nose up whilst calmly calling for go-round power, following the procedure for a terrain escape maneuver. The nose began to rise and the engine spooled up toward full go-round thrust, alerting the passengers that something was now suddenly wrong, but they wouldn't have had any time to realize what. 6 seconds after the GPWS had sounded, Air New Zealand Flight 901 slammed directly into a glacier at an altitude of 1,500 feet on the lower slopes of Mount Erebus. The brutal impact completely ripped the aircraft apart, sending huge pieces of the DC-10 tumbling up the inclined face of the mountain, surrounded by billowing flames from the ruptured fuel tanks. And then, a few seconds later, the debris came to a stop, and the silence again returned to this desolate place at the bottom of the world. Nothing was moving anymore. After about half an hour with no word from the DC-10, the McMurdo controllers declared it missing and began an absolutely unprecedented search operation. News of a missing aircraft in Antarctica spread quickly, even before the wreckage was finally discovered at 1 o'clock in the morning on the following day, still smouldering under the midnight sun. None of the 257 passengers and crew had survived, making this crash the worst peacetime disaster in New Zealand's modern history, and the recovery work was then absolutely grueling. The initial investigation by the OAAI found that the probable causes was the captain's decision to continue the flight at low level towards an area of poor surface and horizon definition when the crew was not certain of their position, and the subsequent inability to detect the rising terrain which intercepted the aircraft's flight path. But the evidence presented to the Commission of Inquiry, led by Justice Mann, would later overturn those findings. He concluded that the crew was certain of their position, albeit mistaken, and that flight at such low level was permitted and likely encouraged by Air New Zealand. So his commission instead came to the conclusion that the probable cause of the accident was a breakdown in communication within the Flight Operations Department of Air New Zealand, which resulted in the nav track being changed to overfly Mount Erebus without anyone informing the crew. But it then went much further than just determining the probable cause. In fact, he wrote in his final report that Air New Zealand knew that the nav track change had caused the accident from the very beginning, and that airline management and executives had conspired to cover up this fact by shredding documents and providing false testimony to both Chippendale and the Royal Commission. And that is what led Mann to write what is probably the most infamous line ever included in an aircraft accident report. The palpably false sections of evidence which I heard could not have been the result of mistake or faulty recollection. They originated, I am compelled to say, in a predetermined plan of deception. They were very clearly part of an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders, and so, in regard to the particular items of evidence to which I have referred, I am forced reluctantly to say that I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies. This judgment became extremely controversial in New Zealand, and the bombshell report soon devolved into partisan attacks that even involved the Prime Minister himself. who later got into a series of ugly public disputes with just this man over his findings. In the end, Air New Zealand appealed for judicial review by the Privy Council in London, which ultimately found that Mann's allegations of conspiracy and perjury exceeded his mandate, which was only to find the causes of the accident and the parties responsible. And as a result of that, this part of his conclusion was officially thrown out. But the impact that his findings had on the New Zealand society cannot be understated. No other aircraft accident investigation in history has become so publicly involved. I mean, just this man received flowers on his door, people paid for his meals in restaurants, and copies of his report later flew off the bookstore shelves. Even though his findings was overturned on a technicality, we still don't know for sure if there really was an orchestrated litany of lies, or whether people were just trying to cover for themselves. And to be honest, it probably doesn't matter. The real lessons from this accident, I think, lie in the need to treat unusual operations with the utmost respect, both from a planning and a human factors perspective. Because if we don't respect hostile places like Antarctica, then it's so easy to get drawn into the traps that those kind of places will inevitably set. Just this man actually felt that same way, which is why I want to end this video with the words that he used to conclude the report. For the ultimate key to the tragedy lay here, in the white silence of Lewis Bay, the place to which the airliner had been unerringly guided by its microelectronic navigation system, only to be destroyed in clear air and without warning by a malevolent trick of the polar light. Now, my team have been working super hard to make this video a reality. Everyone from our scriptwriter Kira, who has been churning through thousands of pages of documents to write this, to our graphics team, who have been working day and night to get you this video on time. I am so proud of everyone involved, and if you want to take part in supporting this kind of mammoth productions, then please scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.